On Saturday, April 16, 1960, Irene Garza, 25, went missing after going to confession at Sacred Heart Church in McAllen, Texas. Irene Garza, Center, was a beloved second-grade teacher and had been a local beauty queen. Irene Garza's high-heeled shoe was later found near an empty road. Irene Garza's patent leather purse was also found in the middle of a field. 5 days after she disappeared, Irene Garza's body was found floating in an irrigation canal. Garza was found fully dressed, except for her shoes and underwear. Her lavender blouse had been unbuttoned. The autopsy revealed that Irene Garza had been beaten with a hard object, sexually assaulted, and suffocated. Father John Fate became a suspect early in the investigation. Fate, 27, admitted he had heard Irene's confession in the rectory the night she disappeared, Sacred Heart Rectory, where Father Fate said he had heard Irene's confession. At the time, giving a face-to-face confession was considered highly unusual. Many people in McAllen wondered whether a deal had been struck between the church and the DA's office, or if elected officials in the overwhelmingly Catholic town were afraid to challenge the church. As Irene's aunt, Herlinda de la Vina, told me in 2005, who were we to question a priest? The Texas Rangers Cold Case Unit reopened the case 4 decades later, in 2002, and turned up even more damning evidence. A former priest from Oklahoma City named Dale Tacheny came forward to say that Fate had detailed the crime to him when they lived in a Trappist monastery in Missouri in the 60s. According to Tacheny, the priest said that he had assaulted, bound, and gagged a woman after hearing her confession. Later, he put a bag over her head, suffocated her, and dumped her body by a canal. The Rangers also interviewed Father O'Brien, who said he had important information about the case that he would divulge if, and only if, he were brought before a grand jury. When police drained the canal at the end of April 1960, they found a green slide viewer near where they believe Irene Garza's killer had dumped her body. Investigators at the bank of the canal where they believe the killer had dumped Irene Garza's body. The police appealed to the public for help in finding the slide viewer's owner. Father John Fate sent police a note saying that the photo slide viewer was his. Investigators' interest in Father John Fate deepened when they learned of an attack on another woman 3 weeks before Irene Garza's murder. Maria America Guerra, pictured here, fought off an attack from a man she thought looked like a priest inside a church in Edinburgh, Texas. After Irene Garza was murdered, Maria America Guerra picked out John Fate from a police lineup as the man who had attacked her. Father Fate had visible scratches on the backs of his hands when he was photographed by police. Father O'Brien had noticed them as well, and Fate had explained that he had been locked out of his residence and had scratched them while trying to climb in through a second-story window. Father Fate stood trial in Austin charged with assault with intent to rape Maria America Guerra. But the jury deadlocked. Rather than face another trial, he later pleaded no contest to a lesser charge of aggravated assault and was fined $500. Noe Ponce Sigler recalls finding her father, one of the original investigators in the Irene Garza case, very upset one day. She says he had been told to step away from the case and that his superiors would take over. The Irene Garza case eventually grew cold. Noemi Ponce Sigler says her father, Milo Ponce, pictured, never got over the case. Ponce Sigler fought for justice for more than 30 years in honor of her father. Father Fate ended up at various monasteries. The Irene Garza case faded from the headlines. In 2002, McAllen Police Chief Victor Rodriguez decided to reopen the investigation into Irene Garza's 1960 murder. Chief Rodriguez brought in the newly formed Cold Case Unit of the Texas Rangers. Ranger Rudy Jaramillo was leading the investigation. In 2002, Dale Tacheny came forward telling police that John Fate had told him he had killed a woman in the 1960s around Easter. Father Joseph O'Brien, who had been the assistant pastor of the Sacred Heart Church in McAllen, came forward saying that Fate had made an admission of guilt to him as well. Despite the new witnesses, Renee Guerra, the Hidalgo County District Attorney at the time, did not think they were credible. Irene Garza's cousin, Linda de la Vina, recalls Renee Guerra confronting her in the courthouse and telling her that she would never get an indictment in the case. In early 2014, 48 hours, Correspondent Richard Schlesinger confronted John Fate outside his home in Arizona about the allegations surrounding him. Fate denied killing Irene Garza. Sylvia is pictured here at Irene's house. Beatrice Garcia testified that in 1960 Father John Fate stopped her as she was walking and asked if he could take pictures of her dressed in black by the cemetery. Beatrice Garcia in the 1960s. She says in the weeks before Irene Garza was murdered, she had a bizarre encounter with Father Fate. Anna Maria Hollingsworth testified that Irene Garza had told her that Father Fate had previously pulled Irene out of the church confessional and had insisted she give her confession in the rectory. Darrell Davis, seated, a former reporter, testified about an off-the-record meeting between reporters and the DA in 1962. According to Davis, said that they knew Fate had murdered Irene Garza and that he would be sent to a monastery. On D7, 2017, John Bernard Fate, 85, was found guilty of the murder of Irene Garza. Assistant DA Mike Garza holds up a photo of Irene Garza as he urges the jury to consider sentencing John Fate to 57 years in prison. The following day, the jury sentenced John Fate to life. Investigators and Irene's family believe Irene Garza is finally resting in peace. Fate had left the priesthood decades earlier, had married, and raised 3 children. In 2014, Ricardo Rodriguez defeated Rene Guerra in the election for district attorney. Rodriguez had promised to look into the Irene Garza case. February 2016, John Fate was arrested in the murder of Irene Garza. Late 2017, 57 years after the murder of Irene Garza, John Fate stood trial for her murder. Assistant District Attorney Mike Garza points to John Fate in court. Garza says Fate killed Irene Garza with malice aforethought. Defense attorney Renee O. Flores says John Fate is innocent and that there wasn't any forensic evidence whatsoever collected then and now that affirmatively relate John Fate to this crime in any way. Sylvia Acevedo Stern grew up next door to Irene Garza. Irene's parents were her godparents. Sylvia Acevedo Stern, who was 8 years Irene's junior, looked up to her and emulated her. Margaret Peggy Beck. The oldest case we have for you today went unresolved for an astonishing 56 years. This case was resolved using innovative DNA testing, similar to others discussed today. Investigators believe it is the oldest cold case to be solved through the use of genealogy databases. Despite being resolved, there are still many unsolved questions regarding this case. In August 1963, Margaret Peggy Beck traveled with her Girl Scouts. The 16-year-old was at the Flying G Ranch Girl Scouts camp near Deckers, where she was a counselor after having joined the Girl Scouts when she was 9. When she wasn't at camp, Peggy lived in Edgewater, Colorado with her parents and 3 sisters. On August 18th, around midnight, Peggy went into her tent alone. The Girl Scouts had been on a 5-day-long trip, and this was the last night, so Peggy was likely looking forward to some sleep. On normal nights, she would be accompanied by her tent mate, Claudia Shrine, but the girl had come down with a cold and was sleeping in the infirmary. The tents were spread out, leaving Peggy alone and about 30 feet away from anyone else. When Peggy didn't show up for breakfast the next day, her tent mate went to find her and found Peggy zipped in her sleeping bag. She tried to wake her up, but nothing worked. Shocked, Claudia alerted the scout leaders, who discovered that Peggy had died sometime during the night. Initially, the scout leaders believed that Peggy had died from natural causes. And so they told Claudia to pack up both hers and Peggy's belongings while they took down her tent and cleared up the area as was normal after a camping trip. It took the leaders 8 hours to finally contact police with no explanation except that they believed that the otherwise healthy 16-year-old had died naturally, until they noticed bruises growing on her neck. The bruises were seen by police as evidence that she died as a result of strangulation. An investigation revealed that someone entered Peggy's tent, assaulted her, killed her, and then re-zipped her sleeping bag. The authorities suspected that her attackers had previously killed her, based on their deliberate actions of zipping her body into the sleeping bag. Peggy fought, and skin cells were detected under her fingernails. The scout leaders accidentally hampered the police investigation by contaminating the crime site while cleaning it. Much evidence was lost or disrupted. Investigators had challenges in developing a profile to identify Peggy's killer. However, later that day, authorities received a tip that a man at a bus stop had scratches on his face, similar to those Peggy may have inflicted on her attacker. However, after interviewing the individual, police released him. James Sherbandi, who had been imprisoned for 25 years, was also a suspect in the murder of an Eagle County Sheriff's deputy. After Peggy's death, Sherbandi ceased communicating with his parole officer, although he was ultimately cleared. For years, there were several suspects and even some genuine admissions to the crime. Peggy's parents both died before the murderer of their daughter was apprehended. However, even after 50 years, her case remained remembered. Investigators reopened Peggy's case in 2007 after technology successfully generated a profile from the skin cells that had been first taken from beneath her fingernails. When the DNA profile was entered into CODIS, no matches were found. But when a full profile could be made in 2019, the case was re-examined and this time it indicated a family. Police were alerted because they thought their suspect had to be related to the family. In order to help identify the murderer, the family complied by providing DNA samples. The police had a name in 2020, 56 years after the crime: Taylor James Raymond. When Peggy died, Taylor would have been in his early 20s. He resided in Edgewater and was a TV and radio repairman. Taylor is thought to have been familiar with the isolated location where the Girl Scouts would camp because he had visited there to construct ham radios. He is said to have been looking for a victim that evening when he noticed Peggy by herself. However, there is still a significant issue with the case. Since the 1970s, Taylor's family has not seen or spoken to him. He was in Las Vegas in 1976, which is when his last known whereabouts was. Investigators have stated that they had been looking for any sign of Taylor for several months without success. He would currently be around 82 years old. They don't know what happened to him or where he is. They don't even know if he's still alive at this point. But the hunt for him is still ongoing. Jefferson County Sheriff Jeff Schrader has stated that nothing would give us greater pleasure than to actually put handcuffs on James Taylor. It has been terrible for Peggy's 3 sisters to reopen the wound of their siblings' premature death, but they have finally found the closure they had hoped for. Even though it isn't exactly what they wanted, the police are actively looking for Taylor in order to bring justice to Peggy's killing. When the sisters learned that Taylor's name had been made public, they prepared a joint statement in which they said, "Peggy was a lovely young lady who loved life. We will always treasure our memories of her since she was devoted to and protective of her family." The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office has issued a warrant for Taylor's arrest. Additionally, anyone with information regarding Taylor is urged to contact the number provided. Daly, Christopher Alvin. Of all these recently resolved cases, the one involving 26-year-old Christopher Alvin Daly is the most peculiar. 2 17-year-olds who were out in the isolated region gathering leaves discovered Christopher Daly's body close to an abandoned logging road in Huntsville, Alabama, on April 26, 1995, 1 hour before he was reported missing. It seemed like a single bullet wound to the head had killed Christopher. His 1983 tan Toyota Tercel was discovered nearby, partially buried in the Tennessee River. Investigators discovered a big rock attached to the accelerator when they unlocked the car. They were also able to confirm that the body 4 miles away was that of Christopher Daly, and they discovered his wallet and identification. Christopher was last seen at a meeting for the Huntsville Hilton Hotel, where he was a server, and was only reported missing a full day later. To discover Christopher's killer, police officers launched a thorough investigation, but they were unable to uncover any leads. Police today rely extensively on location mobile phone data and surveillance film, which they did not have access to since there were no hints as to who might have killed the young man. They actually never identified any suspects in the case. Sergeant John Bradford of the Decatur Police Department at the time allegedly called the case a real whodunit. Over the years, Investigators repeatedly re-examined the case in the hopes of uncovering fresh evidence that would identify a suspect in Christopher's killing, but nothing new ever came to light. Despite never being formally closed, the case swiftly became doomed to remain a cold case. For 25 years, Christopher's murder would go unsolved. The violent crimes detective Sean Mukadam took one of the strangest calls of his 15-year tenure on November 18, 2020. When the caller said, "I want to confess to a murder I did years ago," he initially assumed it was a joke. When he requested for more information, the caller said he couldn't recall the precise time he had committed the murder but believed it was in the 1980s, which made Mukadam suspicious. Mukadam had to match the crime with the murderer by working backwards after receiving confessions, something that doesn't happen very often. In order to narrow down the area and year to one that sounded comparable to what the caller had described, he and other detectives compiled unsolved cases from the 1980s. According to Mukadam, they had to search far and wide for cases that were comparable. But eventually it seemed as though the caller was recounting the death of Christopher Daly 25 years earlier. Mukadam put the caller to the test by posing case-related queries that only an involved party could adequately respond to. Only at that point did the cops realize the caller was real and confessing to the crime. The 53-year-old caller, Johnny Dwight Whited, consented to meet with investigator Mukadam and gave him directions to the murder site from the rear of a patrol car. This included exiting the car and walking to the precise location where Christopher's Toyota had been partially submerged. Whited's detailed description of the vehicle's entry into the river, including reenacting the incident, satisfied the detective. Like many other families of cold case victims, they never expected to know the truth. Solving cold cases provides families with answers about their loved one's tragic death. Mukadam believes Whited called in his confession to provide closure to Christopher's family. Whited did not divulge his motive for killing Christopher, but did admit that he had only met him briefly before his death. Mukadam stated, he claimed he was sorry and wished it had never happened. He blamed it on his mental state at the time. This is not an excuse to kill someone. There's no excuse for killing someone else. Investigators continue to be frustrated by the missing motive. Some details about the killer have been uncovered, including Whited's history of drug-related arrests. He was caught for possessing a crack pipe just 3 weeks after Christopher's body was discovered. Interestingly, Whited is scheduled for a second trial in May 2021. This time, it's a methamphetamine charge. It is unknown if Whited's drug crimes are linked to his homicide of Christopher Daly. Whited's future trial in mid-2021 will expose further details about the crime, providing closure for Christopher's family. More cold cases are being solved, and DNA evidence is being used to identify culprits and bring justice. However, closure and justice do not always follow expectations. We can only hope that additional atrocities are solved even decades later.